After the declaration of martial law, Ferdinand Marcos continued to solidify his power through the expansion of the executive, establishment of a military supremacy, and consolidation of a new oligarchy. His dictatorship, however, did not go unchallenged. Mass movements, underground activists, and political opposition were never totally quelled by Marcos's authoritarian regime. Senator Ninoy Aquino, who was at the helm of the traditional opposition, paid for his adamant resistance to Marcos with his life. On August 21, 1983, Ninoy was assassinated in broad daylight. His death, however, awoke in the masses a feeling of deep resentment over the years of Marcos's corruption, human rights violation, and misgovernance. 1983 signaled the unrelenting anti-Marcos movement that culminated in EDSA. Corazon Aquino emerged as the much-needed figure of peace and democracy. Despite the fraudulent snap elections that declared Marcos as the elected president, the people refused to yield to his dictatorship once more. They flocked to the streets and faced the military tanks and guns with flowers, rosaries, and indefatigable resolve to end the 2 decades of tyranny and despotism. But what was the EDSA Republic really about? In the 13th episode of Primary Sources and You, let us look back to the year that followed the EDSA People Power Revolution through Cory Aquino's speech before the U.S. Congress on September 18, 1986 and answer the question, may nagbago ba? This is Podcast, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society.
Hello, EDSA People Power na tayo. Kung sa classroom setup ng Philippine History class, patapos na yung syllabus. No? Ako si Aaron.
At kung sa high school naman, 4th grading period na. Yan ay kung matatapos lahat ng lessons at noong may Philippine history pa. Kasi ngayon sa high school, wala nang Philippine history. Dapat ibalik natin yan. Hello sa inyong lahat, ako si Lee.
And I'm Vec. Pero dapat talaga sinisikap natin na umabot yung discussion sa martial law. I mean, given the systemic attempt to historical distortion made by the apologists of a dictator. Pero in the process of studying the history of martial law, dapat maipakita yung, una sa lahat, yung crimes ng dictatorship, which actually included corruption na I think inoperationalize niya through a demented sense of development economics kung saan he funneled government-funded resources to his cronies, corporations, and businesses. Siyempre, ang tawag dyan, crony capitalism. At yan ay nag-reflect actually sa pagtaas ng government expenditure on projects for these cronies and eventually it constituted 43%. Tumataginting na 43% ng lahat ng expenditure ng gobyerno.
Yeah, totoo yun, no? At minsan yan ngang development economics at yung policies on the economy na inimplement ni Marcos would sometimes be used as the justification for that golden age idea and that na napakagaling ni Marcos as president, 'di ba? Na ang dami daw napagawa. So kung anti-Marcos ka, wag ka dumaan ng EDSA, yung mga ganong ideya, 'di ba? Pero yung minsan yung isang tanong ko rin doon sa mga ganong claims ay syempre parang lampas halos dalawang dekada in power si Marcos. Nakakahiya naman kung wala talaga siyang mapatayo na infrastructure, diba? Tsaka ang dami niyang inutang, nakakahiya naman kung wala siyang nagawa. Pero yung bigger question ko usually doon is parang at what cost, 'di ba? Na may mga ganito kang infrastructure pero at what cost, 'di ba? Kaya din kailangan din nating makita yung halimbawa yung really bad human rights record ng regime ni Ferdinand Marcos, 'di ba? Halimbawa sa tala ng Amnesty International, around 3,000 people were extrajudicially killed during that time, no? That's halos 35,000 people were tortured. And syempre, yung political detention pa halimbawa rose to around 70,000, 'di ba? So ganun yung gravity nung state oppression at silencing na ginawa nung government nung time na yon. So, at syempre, conservative estimate pa yun Kaya nga, some people would actually lament how Marcos, quote-unquote, erased an entire generation of idealists. Diba? Ganun yung magnitude nung impact nung ginawa niya. No? So, given the number of activists who suffered from the violation of their human rights, in levels that exceeded other global despots like ano ba, Augusto Pinochet of Chile. No? Yung parang comparable siya sa ganong global scale.
At talagang global level nga, itong diktadorya ni Marcos. I mean, it was also during his time that the foreign debt of the Philippines increased from $2 billion in 1972 to $25 billion in 1983. So more than 10 times increase in a decade's time. So that's kind of record-breaking. Pero gumanda ba yung ekonomiya dahil dito? Parang hindi naman. Ang national deficit din natin tumaas from 1.2% ng ating GNP nung kanyang unang termino to 4.2% from the period of 1972 to 1982. Tapos even the inflation tumaas ng 5-folds in a year, 1983 to 1984. So talagang crisis. At I think yung the closest crisis we have to this period is the current crisis we're experiencing right now in the Philippines, no? Pero yan, bukod dito sa economic mismanagement niya, dapat mapanggit din natin yung kasalanan niya, lalo na sa Muslim Mindanao at sa Sangkamorohan, like the Jabida Massacre.
Na recently, nag-anniversary, ano?
Yeah.
Pero yun nga aside from learning about Marcos's offenses and crimes, and yun nga, negligence and mismanagement, I think yung pangalawang bagay na dapat din tinuturo sa pagtuturo ng kasaysayan ng batas militar ay yung anti-Marcos movement na nag-emerge ng panahon na to mula sa iba't ibang sektor ng Philippine society. Mula sa mga alagad ng simbahan hanggang sa mga universities and high schools, mula sa mga manggagawa hanggang sa mga magbubukid. Tapos mula dun sa mga tao na who really took up arms believing that the only way to go in this kind of political situation was an armed revolution, hanggang doon sa mga traditional opposition who fought Marcos from inside the government. So hindi rin talaga sila nanahimik at the expense sometimes of their freedom, of their comfort, and ultimately of their lives. And this sustained struggle against Marcos culminated in EDSA. Tulad nung nabanggit natin kanina, the EDSA People Power restored democracy. But 35 years hence, I think magandang tanungin, anong klaseng demokrasya yung na-restore?
Exactly, no? Tamang tanong yun na, 'di ba? Parang ano yung nangyari dun sa promise ng EDSA, 'di ba? Yung promise na pagbabago, yung promise na reform, at yung promise nga na yan, yung restoration ng democracy. And I think magandang masagot yan, syempre by looking at yung term ng isa siya syempre sa very important figure sa ating history, yung naging embodiment, poster child, poster girl ng promise of EDSA. No, syempre ito si Corazon Aquino, no? So ano nga ba yung naging legacy ni Tita Cory? At ano ba yung gobyerno na na-envision, na na-execute at iniwan niya?
At dapat pa-contextualize natin yan din sa kanyang background as a person. I mean, aside from the fact that she did not dabble in politics before her candidacy, she had always been in the shadow of Ninoy Aquino. And more importantly, she was also part of an elite family in Tarlac. So, Panginoong may lupa talaga ang kanyang pamilya. At mahalaga ring masilip, bukod sa kanyang legacy sa EDSA, ay yung class interests niya at paano ito nag-manifest sa kanyang leadership.
And I think, para magawa yan, ang gagawin natin, titingnan natin yung isang speech na dineliver niya before the US Congress. So, halimbawa dito sa speech na to, makikita how her presidency, and in fact, her convictions, were anchored on Ninoy Aquino and on his martyrdom. Na para bang yung pagkapatay kay Ninoy, yung nagbigay ng legitimacy sa democratic movement that she actually found herself leading. So, pakinggan natin yung ilang bahagi ng talumpati ni Cory that demonstrated, first and foremost, Ninoy's heroism.
14 years ago this month was the first time we lost him. A president turned dictator and traitor to his oath, suspended the Constitution, and shut down the Congress that was much like this one, before which I am honored to speak. He detained my husband along with thousands of others, senators, publishers, and anyone who had spoken up for the democracy as its end drew near. But for Ninoy, a long and cruel ordeal was reserved. The dictator already knew that Ninoy was not a body merely to be imprisoned, but a spirit he must break. The government sought to break him by indignities and terror, They locked him up in a tiny, nearly airless cell in a military camp in the north. They stripped him naked and held the threat of a sudden midnight execution over his head. Ninoy held up manfully under all of it. I barely did as well. For 43 days, the authorities would not tell me what had happened to him. This was the first time my children and I felt we had lost him. When that didn't work, they put him on trial for subversion, murder, and a host of other crimes before a military commission. Ninoy challenged its authority and went on a fast. If he survived it, then he felt God intended him for another fate. We had lost him again, for nothing would hold him back from his determination to see his fast through to the end. He stopped only when it dawned on him that the government would keep his body alive after the fast had destroyed his brain. And so, with barely any life in his body, he called off the fast on the 40th day. And then we lost him irrevocably and more painfully than in the past. The news came to us in Boston. It had to be after the 3 happiest years of our lives together. But his death was my country's resurrection in the courage and faith by which alone they could be free again.
O, 'di ba? Parang in a way nakakakilapot din siya pag inisip mo yung context kung kailan niya dineliver yung speech na yan, 'di ba? Sa mga listeners natin, available sa iba't ibang internet platforms like YouTube, halimbawa, yung speeches na yan, no, kung gusto nilang mapanood ng buo, no? So, this is, this was how Cory started the speech, no? She started it with the story of Ninoy, 'di ba? A very familiar story to many or most Filipinos during that time. To syempre, I guess, highlight the level of violence committed by the Marcos dictatorship, and not just the gravity of the violence, but also how personal it was for her and her family, 'di ba? So parang illegal detention, arrest, torture, and murder, parang naranasan ni Ninoy, at syempre hindi naman immune yung family niya from feeling the pain na feel niya, although on a different level. Pero syempre, yung anguish din to have your husband or your father being detained and thinking na tino-torture siya, syempre grabe din yung sariling torture na naranasan ng pamilya, 'di ba? So, at syempre madami pang Pilipino, some of them did not even realize na namatay na yung kamag-anak nila kasi desaparecido, 'di ba? So yung mga ganong kwento ay napaka-resonating, napaka-resonant sa mga madaming Pilipino nung time na yon. Na yun talaga yung isang cornerstone kung bakit madaming Pilipino yung nanindigan na dapat papatalsik si Marcos.
Cory proceeded to tell the story of the beginning of the end for the dictator. Dito kinuwento niya yung snap elections, which she called an excess of arrogance. Kasi nga naman, di ba, Marcos was supposedly confident that he still had the mandate of the people. Hence, he had the nerve to call for elections. But could it be that Marcos was getting his confidence because he could control the outcome of the elections? Kasi he won in the end, beating Cory by a margin of 1.5 million votes. Dito rin talaga nagalit yung mga tao kasi dinaya yung elections. And even the International Observer Delegation, yan ang sinabi.
Di ba dito nga yung kwento ng mga COMELEC tabulators na nag-walk out mula dun sa mga polling precincts kasi hindi na nila masikmura yung nawi-witness nilang harapang pagdadagdag at pagbabawas sa boto ni Marcos at ni Cory. So yung nangyari sa EDSA, para siyang siya yung culmination ng mga events na nagpatong-patong over the weeks since the February 7 snap elections. Pero actually, it can be argued na simula pa lang nung 1983, pagkamatay ni Ninoy, doon nagsimula yung pagpapatong-patong at paglakas ng anti-Marcos movement. Kasi the last years of dictatorship really saw the rise of anti-Marcos coalitions, including Jaja, halimbawa, yung Justice for Aquino, Justice for All. Pero para kay Cory, integral yung karakter ng EDSA. Nung nangyari sa EDSA People Power, for the shape that her presidency would take. So sabi niya, I became president through the forces of democracy in peaceful means, and I intend to lead the country upholding the very same values. At gagawin niya raw yun through a people's constitution.
As I came to power peacefully, so shall I keep it. That is my contract with my people and my commitment to God. He had willed that the blood drawn with the lash shall not in my country be paid by blood drawn by the sword, but by the tearful joy of reconciliation. We have swept away absolute power by a limited revolution that respected the life and freedom of every Filipino. Now we are restoring full constitutional government. Again, as we restore democracy by the ways of democracy, so are we completing the constitutional structures of our new democracy under a constitution that already gives full respect to the Bill of Rights. A jealously independent constitutional commission is completing its draft, which will be submitted later this year to a popular referendum. When it is approved, there will be elections for both national and local positions. So within about a year from a peaceful but national upheaval that overturned a dictatorship, we shall have returned to full constitutional government. Given the polarization and breakdown we inherited, this is no small achievement. My predecessor set aside democracy to save it from a communist insurgency that numbered less than 500. Unhampered by respect for human rights, he went at it with hammer and tongs. By the time he fled, that insurgency had grown to more than 16,000. I think there is a lesson here to be learned about trying to stifle a thing with the means by which it grows. I don't think anybody in or outside our country concerned for a democratic and open Philippines doubts what must be done. Through political initiatives and local reintegration programs, we must seek to bring the insurgents down from the hills, and by economic progress and justice, show them that which the best intentioned among them fight. As president of all my people, I will not betray the cause of peace by which I came to power. Yet equally and again, no friend of Filipino democracy will challenge this. I will not stand by and allow an insurgent leadership to spurn our offer of peace and kill our young soldiers and threaten our new freedom.
This quote is really interesting. Bukod sa pag-flex sa ida-draft na constitution, she also talked at length about the program on the communist insurgency. Sabi ni Cory, I think there is a lesson here to be learned about trying to stifle a thing with the means by which it grows. So, isinisisi niya kay Marcos yung paglakas ng rebellion. Sinasabi niya na without the conditions caused by the Marcos government, hindi naman dapat naging malaking problema yung communist movement in the first place. So, sana nakikinig si Duterte, no? Anyway, binabanggit din dito sa speech ni Cory na should the communists refuse to relent and continue to cause trouble, she would also do what was necessary to protect the country's democracy.
'Diba? Oo. So, dito mo rin makita na she was also a politician in many ways, 'diba? Na alam din niya, these people want to hear this, so I'm gonna give this to you, 'diba? So, lilitaw at lilitaw din yung allegiance, 'diba? I mean, tandaan pa din natin yung idea na the US was still continuing that struggle with the Soviet Union nung time na to. So, she was basically telling the US that the communism was still a problem. Pero it was a problem that was caused and exacerbated by Marcos. 'Di ba? Yun yung tie-in niya dun sa events nung time na yon. So now that he is gone, you know, ang idea ni Cory, ang pinopropagate niyang idea dito sa speech ay hindi na dapat problema yung communism kasi wala na yung gustong labanan nung rebel groups, no? So pero yun nga for the liberal and elite Cory, communism was still seen as a problem that we ought to deal with one way or another, no? So in a way parang foreshadowing din ito nung mangyayari sa relasyon between Cory and the revolutionary left, no? So in the next months, no, after this speech, we would see how the Cory administration steadily drifted in a way to the right, no? So how the peace talk between the CPP-NPA and the Philippine government would fail, and basically how the Mindiola massacre would take place, no? And so on, yung mga ganong landmark events that see the limits, that expose the limits of Cory's leadership as well in terms of enacting a peaceful resolution to the struggles of the CPP, no? So sa kaluluduluhan, no, nanaig pa din yung impluwensya ng US at the establishment.
And on that note, siguro maganda na ma-point out yung kabalintunaan or yung irony nitong speech na to, ano? I mean, here was Cory boasting about the historic people power, celebrating the fall of the dictator in the United States. But we know that Marcos's greatest supporter and sponsor was actually the US. I mean, who rescued Marcos and his family nung nangyayari na yung EDSA People Power? Sino bang naglipad sa kanila sa Hawaii? Di ba US Air Force? Tapos etong mga Amerikanong to, kung makastanding ovation kay Cory, kala mo wala nangyari, no? So ibig sabihin, while there was a clear break between Cory and Marcos, indeed para naman talaga silang diametric opposite ang isa't isa sa unang tingin, andun pa din yung fundamental similarity between the two. They were both neoliberal, and they both sought the favor of the US. So, they might be different politically, pero meron at meron pa ding intersection in their ideologies. And at the same time, syempre, and I think as a consequence also, in their respective economic and foreign policies. Pero syempre, Cory still took a swipe at Marcos's foreign debt and economic mismanagement. So, toward the end of her speech, I think it was quite clear that Cory was appealing for economic aid and support from the United States.
Finally, may I turn to that other slavery, our $26 billion foreign debt. I have said that we shall honor it, yet the means by which we shall be able to do so are kept from us. Many of the conditions imposed on the previous government that stole this debt continue to be imposed on us, who never benefited from it. And no assistance or liberality commensurate with the calamity that was visited on us has been extended. Yet ours must have been the cheapest revolution ever. With little help from others, we Filipinos fulfilled the first and most difficult condition of the debt negotiation, the full restoration of democracy and responsible government. Today, we face the aspiration of a people who had known so much poverty and massive unemployment for the past 14 years, and yet offer their lives for the abstraction of democracy. Wherever I went in the campaign, slum area or impoverished village, they came to me with one cry: democracy. Not food, although they clearly needed it, but democracy. Not work, although they surely wanted it, but democracy. not money, for they gave what little they had to my campaign. They didn't expect me to work a miracle that would instantly put food into their mouths, clothes on their back, education in their children, and give them work that will put dignity in their lives. But I feel the pressing obligation to respond quickly as the leader of a people so deserving of all these things. Half our export earnings, $2 billion out of $4 billion, which is all we can earn in the restrictive markets of the world, must go to pay just the interest on a debt whose benefit the Filipino people never received. Still, we fought for honor, and if only for honor, we shall pay. And yet, should we have to wring the payments from the sweat of our men's faces and sink all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil? Yet, to all Americans, as the leader of a proud and free people, I address this question. Has there been a greater test of national commitment to the ideals you hold dear than that my people have gone through? You have spent many lives and much treasure to bring freedom to many lands that were reluctant to receive it. And here you have a people who want it by themselves and need only the help to preserve it.
Okay, this part of her speech, I believe, exposes one of Cory's betrayals of the Filipino people, in my opinion. I mean, she may be portrayed as saintly, pero marami siyang ginawang masasabi nating hindi naaayon sa prinsipyo na naglagay sa kanya sa posisyon niya. Maliban sa sinasabing total war policy ni Cory laban sa mga makakaliwang grupo at yung kanyang malabnaw na agrarian reform program which was designed to fail, frustrating para sa akin yung naging stance niya on paying the dictator's debt. On the one hand, sinasabi niya, okay, meron kaming utang na inutang ng diktador. But since we are an honorable people, babayaran namin yan. Maghirap pa ng mga Pilipino, babayaran namin yan. Parang, bakit di na lang niya inapila na pwede bang wag namin bayaran yan? Kasi di naman namin utang yan eh. Hindi naman yan utang ng taong bayan. Utang yan ng diktador. I mean, pwede naman yan. Nagawa nga yan ng ibang mga bansa na dumaan din sa same upheaval na pinagdaanan ng Pilipinas. Honoring this debt meant that Cory succumbed to the pressure of international creditors like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, as well as governments that we owe, halimbawa, the United States. Na nakakaloko kasi it was through the United States and their support of Marcos that Marcos continued to be president and dictator. So, this debt, we are still paying this, and I think we will pay it until 2025 based on estimates.
Ang hirap talaga nung pag tinitingnan natin yung presidency ni Cory Aquino in light of, for example, discussions on transitional justice and all of these things. Ito na ang daming mabibring to light na mga issues. At isa nga dyan, syempre yung policy na yan dyan sa negotiation with the foreign debt. No? So, parang ang dating kasi nung speech niya ay, we will pay it, pero you should perhaps give us some relief. Na parang ganun na in a way, parang matatali pa lalo yung Pilipinas sa ganung sistema. So, tapos ang weird ng last part, di ba? Kung titingnan natin, sabi niya sa US, parang in a way, deserve namin yung assistance nyo kasi eto kami, we are welcoming you, samantalang sa ibang bansa, you had to spend, lives and money to bring freedom. Pero parang kami, ito na. No, parang, di ba, parang shade ba yun, di ba? Was she saying na, yung ibang bansa, ginera nyo para magka-demokrasya. Sa amin, hindi na kinailangan. We did it on our own. Parang, nandito pa rin ako, lumalapit sa inyo, di ba? No? So, sabi niya pa na, for the Filipino people, kahit naghihirap kami, democracy is the way to go. So, andun talaga yung playing on what these US Congress people wanted to hear. Alam mo yung ganung idea, no? So, kahit na nagugutom at walang trabaho, 'di ba? Parang democracy, or actually liberal democracy, is the way to go. Ganun pa rin yung idea.
Kaya nga 'di ba? So, parang it begs the question, totoo ba? Well, siguro at that point, parang a lot of Filipinos were really keen, really excited on getting democracy. I mean, syempre kapag galing ka sa ganong konteksto. Pero yung tanong, hanggang saan umabot itong aspirations na to? And how long until the people actually got disillusioned with democracy and political freedom that weren't accompanied by economic freedom, by welfare, by security? Diba? I mean, we have to realize that democracy isn't something won in a single moment. Or hindi lang siya na ipapanalo sa isang EDSA People Power. It is something that is nurtured continuously. So, hindi sapat yung pinapaboto mo lang sila every 4 years or every 3 years, diba? The government should be able to provide the people with resources that would actually enable them to meaningfully participate in politics.
Mm-hmm. And that participation in politics, I think, includes having informed opinions about events of the past that are still relevant to the present day. And I think mahalagang sagutin din natin yung laging tinatanong din online sa social media, no? Ano nga ba talaga yung naipanalo sa EDSA noong 1986? At ano yung legacy nito na tinatamasa natin hanggang sa kasalukuyan?
Yeah, actually, very complex yung question na yan na yung diba? Yung tanong na yan kasi para siyang na-fulfill ba yung promise ng EDSA? Diba? Kasi yung idea na land reform, hindi naman talaga na-distribute yung mga lupa sa mga farmers, no? So, tuloy pa rin naman yung extrajudicial killings, meron pa rin media oppression. Pero, yung isang promise naman kasi ng EDSA ay regime change. So, patalsik naman talaga si Marcos. Parang isa ring perspective doon na, are we asking too much on EDSA? Or should we create another discourse and promise of change? Bakit kailangan nating i-latch on yun doon sa EDSA? Yung goal ng EDSA was to topple the dictatorship, na fulfill niya yun. No, pero all the other succeeding events, i-attribute pa rin ba natin sa EDSA? Kaya nga yung ganun yung mga siguro thought-provoking questions na, should we give relevance so much to EDSA? Or has it served its purpose? Yung mga ganong pwede nating pag-usapan pa in future kwentuhan. No? Pero sa susunod nating episode, titingnan natin yung nangyari na after the fall of the dictatorship and mangyayari yung quote-unquote democratization afterwards with the new constitution and so on. No? So yan yung pag-uusapan natin sa huli at final episode. Oh my God, guys! We've reached the season finale of the first Primary Sources and You season of podcast. No? So para updated kayo, make sure to follow us on our social media pages and of course, our website, podcast.org.
And don't forget to share these episodes to your friends para naman magkaroon sila ng refresher on Philippine history.
Again, thank you very much for joining us. See you next week and have a good day.